In the remote mountains of Kentucky, where the dangerous path of the wilderness road carved its way toward the western frontier, an inn once stood that travelers would speak of in hushed, reverent tones. Millbrook Inn, they said, provided something no other establishment could offer, a warmth that extended far beyond the comfort of clean beds and hot meals. This mountain sanctuary was run by 4 sisters, and weary men would arrive as strangers, only to leave feeling as if they had discovered something precious, something that made the treacherous journey back worthwhile. A reputation had spread across 3 states for the Cunningham Sisters. Business trips would be delayed by merchants just to spend extra nights at Millbrook Inn. Rather than miss the opportunity to experience the sisters' legendary hospitality, cattlemen would take dangerous detours through hostile mountain passes. And those who had stayed there spoke of comforts that lonely travelers rarely found. Attention so personal, so intimate, that grown men would weep when the time came to leave. But in the winter of 1851, a change occurred. Throughout Kentucky, travelers began arriving at settlements with disturbing tales. The road to Millbrook Inn, they claimed, had become littered with abandoned wagons and riderless horses. These reports were dismissed by local authorities as frontier hysteria, until a pattern emerged that could no longer be ignored. Dozens of men had vanished without a trace, and the last place anyone remembered seeing them was on the winding mountain path that led to the Cunningham Sisters' welcoming door. Before we continue with the story of what really happened in those isolated Kentucky mountains, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Stories like this are ones you won't want to miss. And tell me in the comments what state you are listening from. I love connecting with listeners from across the country who share my fascination with America's buried secrets. What authorities were about to discover would reveal that the warmth travelers found at Millbrook Inn came with a price far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The year was 1831 when Jeremiah Cunningham succumbed to consumption, leaving behind a thriving mountain estate and 4 daughters whose ages ranged from 16 to 26. Sprawling across 800 acres of fertile mountain land in the remote highlands between Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and the Kentucky frontier, the Cunningham property was complete with livestock, grain fields, and, most importantly, a strategically positioned inn that served travelers heading west on the Wilderness Road. The sharp mind of a born businesswoman was possessed by Margaret, the eldest at 26, and the cold, calculating nature that would later prove so deadly. From their mother, Catherine, 24, had inherited ethereal beauty and an almost supernatural ability to make any man feel like the most important person in the world. The knowledge of mountain herbs and their various properties was shared by Sarah, 22, with her late mother, knowledge that would prove far more sinister than anyone imagined. And an innocent charm that could disarm even the most suspicious traveler was possessed by Elizabeth, the youngest at 16. Built by their grandfather in 1798, the Cunningham estate existed when the Wilderness Road was little more than a dangerous trail carved through hostile territory. By 1831, it had evolved into one of the most respected stopping points for merchants, settlers, and adventurers heading toward the promise of Kentucky's bluegrass country. Prominently on a ridge overlooking the valley below sat the main house, a substantial 2-story log structure with stone foundations. 6 comfortable guest rooms, a large common area with massive stone fireplaces, and a kitchen capable of feeding dozens made up the inn portion. What made the Cunningham place special wasn't just its location or amenities. A reputation for hospitality had been carefully cultivated over 3 decades. Hundreds of miles away, in towns, travelers would speak about the warmth of the Cunningham welcome, the quality of their mountain whiskey, and the comfort of clean beds after weeks on dangerous roads. Something more valuable than gold had been built by Jeremiah. Trust. A small but loyal staff was employed by the property. Since the inn's early days, Ezra Hawthorne, a weathered mountain man in his 50s, had worked as foreman. His knowledge of the mountains was encyclopedic, and his loyalty to the Cunningham family was absolute. 3 years earlier, the Zimmer brothers, Klaus and Heinrich, 2 German immigrants, had arrived seeking work and stability in the New World. They lived in a cabin near the property's eastern boundary and managed the livestock and agricultural operations with Germanic efficiency. The beginning of what locals would later remember as the inn's golden years was marked by the autumn of 1831. Working together initially out of necessity, the sisters discovered they possessed a remarkable ability to make guests feel not just welcome, but genuinely cherished. Margaret's business acumen kept the operation profitable. Catherine's charm kept guests lingering longer than planned. Sarah's knowledge of mountain cooking and medicinal teas enhanced their reputation for comfort, and Elizabeth's youthful enthusiasm made even the weariest travelers smile. But beneath this facade of mountain hospitality, something darker was stirring. The isolation that had once protected the Cunningham family from the dangers of frontier life now provided something else entirely. Privacy. And for 4 young women with sharp minds and few scruples, privacy could be a dangerous thing indeed. A November evening in 1832 was when Thomas Kellerman arrived at Millbrook Inn, and with him came the first hint of the darkness to come. A cattle buyer from Richmond, Kellerman was traveling alone with a substantial purse of gold coins intended for purchases in Kentucky. He was a man of 45 years, recently widowed, with no children and few close ties, precisely the type of guest the sisters would later learn to identify with terrifying precision. When Kellerman's horse stumbled up the winding path to the inn, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow was beginning to fall. With her practiced smile, Margaret greeted him at the door, immediately noting the quality of his clothes, the weight of his saddlebags, and most importantly, the loneliness in his eyes. More than just money was being carried by a man traveling alone just 1 year after losing his wife. He was carrying a desperate need for human connection. "Welcome to Millbrook Inn," Margaret said, her voice carrying just the right mixture of professionalism and warmth. "I'm Margaret Cunningham and these are my sisters. We'll make sure your stay is everything you need it to be." The warm glow of the common room, the smell of Sarah's venison stew, and the sight of Catherine arranging fresh wild flowers despite the season were taken in by Kellerman, his eyes brightening. This was exactly what a lonely widower needed, a place where beautiful, attentive women would treat him like family rather than just another paying customer. An experience unlike any he'd ever encountered at an inn was provided to Kellerman by the sisters over the next 3 days. Restaurant-quality feasts featuring perfectly seasoned game, fresh bread, and her famous honey cakes were provided by Sarah. Lengthy conversations about business and politics were engaged in by Margaret, making him feel intellectually valued. Innocent laughter at his stories from Elizabeth made him feel worldly and important. But what Kellerman truly craved, the illusion of romance, was provided by Catherine. On his second evening, after the other guests had retired, Catherine found Kellerman sitting alone by the fire, staring into the flames with the hollow expression of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. With 2 glasses of Sarah's special spiced rum, she approached, each warming perfectly in crystal tumblers that caught the firelight. "You seem troubled, Mr. Kellerman," she said, settling into the chair beside him with fluid grace. "Sometimes sharing a burden makes it lighter." For the next 2 hours, Kellerman found himself pouring out his heart to this beautiful woman, who listened with such genuine attention. He spoke of his late wife, Mary, of their failed attempts to have children, of returning each evening to an empty house that still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. With perfect sympathy, Catherine listened, occasionally touching his hand or leaning closer with apparent compassion. "Loneliness is a terrible thing," she said softly as the fire burned lower. "But it doesn't have to be permanent." What happened next was never recorded in any official document. But its own story was told by Kellerman's behavior the following morning. With the satisfied expression of a man who had rediscovered reasons for living, he moved through breakfast. Despite his original urgency to reach Kentucky, he extended his stay by 2 additional days. Most tellingly, he began making plans to return to Millbrook Inn on his journey home to Richmond. "I've never experienced hospitality like this," he told Margaret as he prepared to leave. "You and your sisters have created something truly special here. I'll be recommending this place to every traveler I meet." A smile was given by Margaret as she accepted his generous payment, nearly double the standard rate, pressed into her hands with genuine gratitude. "We look forward to your return visit, Mr. Kellerman. Safe travels." But Thomas Kellerman would never complete his journey to Kentucky. 3 days later, his horse was found wandering riderless near Cumberland Gap. Kellerman himself had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a mystery that would never be officially investigated. The assumption, logical enough for the dangerous frontier, was that he had fallen victim to bandits or wild animals. Only the Cunningham sisters knew the truth. In the woods a half-mile from the inn when Kellerman departed that morning, Heinrich Zimmer had been waiting. The German immigrant was handy with tools and possessed the kind of quiet efficiency that made him valuable for tasks that required discretion. The blow that ended his life was never seen by Kellerman, delivered with a blacksmith's hammer to the base of his skull. His body was wrapped in canvas and buried in a predetermined location deep in the mountain forest, while his substantial purse of gold coins found its way back to Millbrook Inn. That night, the four sisters sat around their kitchen table counting Kellerman's money and planning their future. The calculations had been done by Margaret. The amount they just acquired exceeded the inn's legitimate profits for an entire year. That lonely men could be manipulated with shocking ease had been proven by Catherine. That traces of evidence could be eliminated with the right knowledge of chemistry and mountaincraft had been demonstrated by Sarah. And that even the most innocent-seeming person could keep terrible secrets had been shown by Elizabeth. "He won't be missed for weeks," Margaret said, stacking the gold coins with businesslike precision. "No family, no close friends, traveling alone to a place where no one knows him. Perfect." "It was almost too easy," Catherine added, still wearing the same gentle expression she'd used to comfort their victim. "He would have given us anything we asked for." Something far more valuable than gold had been discovered by them that cold November night. They had discovered how to make people disappear. Time to refine their technique was given to the sisters by the winter of 1832, and the protocols that would serve them for nearly 2 decades were established. A system for identifying ideal targets was developed by Margaret with her keen business mind. A man traveling alone, carrying substantial money with few family connections and no fixed schedule that would raise immediate alarm if he failed to arrive at his destination was the perfect victim. Beyond cooking and household management, Sarah's role evolved. Dozens of toxins and their effects were included in her expanded knowledge of mountain plants. Pokeweed berries, when properly prepared, could induce symptoms resembling cholera. Heart failure that appeared natural could be caused by foxglove. Within hours, water hemlock could kill while leaving little trace. A hidden garden behind the main house was established by her where she cultivated these plants alongside legitimate herbs, creating a pharmaceutical arsenal disguised as a medicine patch. The art of emotional manipulation was perfected by Catherine, learning to read men's deepest needs and present herself as the answer to their loneliness. Her targets were studied carefully, adapting her personality to match their desires. For the religious, she became devoutly spiritual. For the intellectual, she transformed into a well-read conversationalist. For the grieving, she offered comfort and understanding. Her ability to become whatever a man needed was both her greatest weapon and her most chilling talent. Despite her youth, Elizabeth proved crucial to the operation's success. Perfect cover for the family's activities was provided by her genuine-seeming innocence. The weariest of guests found it impossible to maintain their suspicion around a girl who seemed incapable of deception. She also served as the early warning system, her naturally friendly demeanor allowing her to extract information about guests' backgrounds, travel plans, and financial situations without raising suspicion. The logistics of disposal had been worked out with Germanic efficiency by the Zimmer brothers. A series of natural caves in the mountainside had been discovered by Klaus, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind a rockfall. Under cover of darkness, bodies could be carried there and sealed behind loose stones where the mountain's chemistry would accelerate decomposition. Personal effects were carefully sorted. Anything valuable was kept, while items that might identify the victim were buried separately or destroyed. Perhaps the most crucial was Ezra Hawthorne's role. His reputation in the region was beyond reproach, and his word carried weight with local authorities. When questions were occasionally raised about missing travelers, Ezra would solemnly confirm that the individual had indeed stayed at Millbrook Inn, but had departed in good health and spirits. His weathered face and honest demeanor had never failed to satisfy even the most persistent inquirer. Their second victim was brought by the spring of 1833, a tobacco merchant named William Fraser from North Carolina. Nearly $500 in silver coins, the proceeds from a successful season's crop sales, was being transported by Fraser. A bachelor of 38 known for his reclusive nature and his practice of making business trips alone to avoid sharing profits with partners, he was. On a rainy April evening, Fraser arrived, immediately drawn to the warmth and comfort of the inn. With precision, the sisters deployed their refined strategy. Business discussions were engaged in by Margaret, learning about his financial situation and travel plans. Exceptional meals were provided by Sarah that made him reluctant to continue his journey. Piano music and innocent charm that reminded him of the daughter he'd never had were provided by Elizabeth. But it was Catherine who sealed Fraser's fate. On his third night at the inn, she found him reading alone in the common room, a leather-bound volume of poetry open on his lap. With apparent shyness, she approached, asking if he might read aloud, as she had little education but loved the sound of beautiful words. For 2 hours Fraser read to Catherine by lamplight, his voice growing stronger and more confident as she listened with rapt attention. When he finished, she placed her hand gently on his arm and told him he had the most beautiful voice she'd ever heard. The loneliness that had hardened around Fraser's heart for decades began to crack. "I've never met anyone like you," he told her, his voice thick with emotion he'd suppressed for years. "You make me feel alive again." "Then don't leave tomorrow," Catherine replied, her eyes reflecting the lamplight with perfect calculated sincerity. "Stay another day. Let me listen to you read again." By a week, Fraser extended his stay, during which Catherine gradually increased their intimacy while Sarah began introducing small amounts of pokeweed extract into his evening tea. The symptoms began subtly: mild stomach discomfort, slight dizziness, nothing alarming enough to cause immediate concern. The stress of travel and the emotional upheaval of his unexpected romantic feelings were attributed by Fraser to his malaise. On his final night at Millbrook Inn, Catherine invited Fraser to join her for a private dinner in her room. His favorite meal along with a bottle of wine laced with a carefully calculated dose of water hemlock extract had been prepared by Sarah. As Fraser sat across from Catherine in the intimate candlelight, sharing his dreams and fears with a woman he believed might change his life forever, he had no idea he was already dying. Exactly as Sarah had predicted, the poison worked. A sudden heart attack brought on by excitement and overexertion was what Fraser's death appeared to be. His body was discovered the next morning in Catherine's bed, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep after a night of passion. Even if a doctor had been available to examine the body, the symptoms perfectly matched those of natural cardiac failure in a middle-aged man with a previously sedentary lifestyle. With appropriate solemnity, Fraser was buried in the inn's small cemetery, a final touch that Margaret had added to their operation. A proper grave complete with a carved headstone gave the appearance of respectful treatment while actually serving as the perfect hiding place. The graves of several generations of Cunningham family members were contained in the cemetery, making additional burials unremarkable to local observers. Into the sisters' growing treasury disappeared Fraser's money and valuable personal effects, while his wagon and horses were sold to traveling merchants passing through weeks later. A decision to settle in Kentucky rather than return to North Carolina was attributed to his disappearance, a plausible explanation that no one thought to question too closely. By the end of 1833, a system that was virtually undetectable had been perfected by the sisters. They had learned to space their crimes carefully, never targeting more than 4 or 5 victims per year to avoid creating patterns that might attract attention. Cover stories for guests who died at the inn were developed by them, ranging from heart attacks to accidents to decisions to settle permanently in the West. Most importantly, they learned to trust each other completely, creating a conspiracy so tight that not even the slightest hint of their activities ever reached the outside world. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror at Millbrook Inn intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the Cunningham sisters were just getting started. Between 1834 and 1845, a reputation that extended throughout the mid-Atlantic region and beyond was achieved by Millbrook Inn. In the same reverent tones reserved for the finest establishments in Richmond or Baltimore, travelers spoke of it. Something unprecedented had been created by the sisters, a remote mountain inn that provided luxury accommodations and service that rivaled the best urban hotels. Their legitimate business operations had been expanded significantly by Margaret. A stable of quality horses for guests was now maintained by the inn, a small distillery producing premium mountain whiskey was operated, and even guided hunting expeditions led by Ezra Hawthorne were offered. Substantial income was provided by these legal enterprises and, more importantly, a reputation as savvy businesswomen rather than simply innkeepers was given to the sisters. The story of their success is told by the guest registry from this period, carefully preserved in the Virginia State Archives. Merchants from Charleston, politicians from Richmond, land speculators from Baltimore, and adventurers from as far away as Boston signed their names in Margaret's elegant ledger book. Many returned multiple times, becoming regular patrons who praised Millbrook Inn to their colleagues and friends. But a carefully orchestrated killing machine that operated with clockwork precision was hidden within this legitimate success. The victim selection had been refined by the sisters to an exact science. An almost supernatural ability to identify the men who would never be missed was developed by Catherine. The loners, the outcasts, the ones carrying secrets that made them avoid close relationships. Dozens of plant and mineral toxins, each with different symptoms and detection profiles, were included in Sarah's expanded knowledge of poisons. Through seemingly innocent conversation, detailed personal information from guests had been learned to be extracted by Elizabeth, and everything was coordinated by Margaret with the precision of a military operation. During these years, approximately 43 victims were claimed by them, the exact number later found by the railroad surveyor. Each death was carefully planned and executed according to strict protocols that minimized risk while maximizing profit. Detailed profiles of their targets were developed by the sisters, sometimes observing potential victims for weeks before making their final decision. Consider the case of Jonathan Waverly, a land surveyor from Pennsylvania who arrived in September 1838. Mapping work for the state government was being conducted by Waverly, a job that required him to travel alone through remote areas for months at a time. Surveying equipment worth considerable money was carried by him along with payment for his work and funds for purchasing land parcels he'd identified as investment opportunities. An ideal target was immediately recognized by Margaret in Waverly. Extended absences from civilization were required by his work, meaning his disappearance might not be noticed for months. A perfect cover story was provided by his surveying activities. He could easily have fallen victim to any number of natural hazards while working alone in dangerous territory. Most importantly, his somewhat antisocial personality meant he had few close friends who would pursue investigations if he failed to return. Immediately, the sisters began their campaign. Special meals featuring game Waverly had watched Ezra hunt were prepared by Sarah, creating a connection between the food and the rugged mountain environment he found so appealing. Conversations about his mapping work were engaged in by Elizabeth, expressing fascination with his technical knowledge and making him feel appreciated for his expertise. Potential land investments were discussed by Margaret with him, positioning herself as a local expert who could help him identify profitable opportunities. But the element that sealed Waverly's fate was provided by Catherine. Not as a potential romantic conquest, but as a kindred spirit who shared his love of the wilderness, she approached him. An apparently extensive knowledge of mountain flora and fauna gleaned from years of careful study that actually served her poison research was revealed by her. Short surveying expeditions around the inn's property were accompanied by her with him, demonstrating a comfort with outdoor life that Waverly found irresistible. "I've never met a woman who understood the mountains the way you do," Waverly told her during one of their excursions, his professional reserve finally cracking. "Most people see only wilderness. But you see the beauty and the order underneath." "I've lived here all my life," Catherine replied, stepping closer to him as they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. "The mountains have taught me things that books never could. Things about life, about death, about the balance between them." Into 3 weeks was extended by Waverly his planned 2-day stay, ostensibly to conduct more thorough surveying work in the area, but actually because he had fallen completely under Catherine's spell. During this time, increasingly potent toxins were gradually introduced by Sarah into his food, creating symptoms that mimicked the early stages of mountain fever, a genuine hazard that had claimed the lives of several surveyors in recent years. Her own innovation was the poison Sarah used for Waverley. An extract from destroying angel mushrooms that produced liver failure over the course of several days. The symptoms perfectly matched those of mountain fever, and even an experienced doctor would have been unlikely to distinguish between the two conditions. A tragic but entirely predictable occupational hazard was what Waverley's death appeared to be. His surveying equipment was sold to a merchant in Kentucky, while his detailed maps became part of Margaret's growing collection of intelligence about the region's geography and resources. His body joined the others in the sealed mountain caves, while his name was added to the local records as another victim of the dangerous frontier lifestyle. Not just in their killing methods, but in their ability to maintain the illusion of respectability lay the brilliance of the sisters' operation. Church services in the nearby settlement of Millbrook were attended by them, generous contributions to community causes were made by them, and friendships with local families were maintained by them. The board of the Regional Merchants Association was served on by Margaret, while medical assistance to neighboring farms during times of illness was provided by Sarah. Sunday school to local children was taught by Catherine, and social events that brought together isolated mountain families were organized by Elizabeth. Multiple purposes were served by this community involvement. Alibis and character witnesses for times when questions might be raised about missing guests were provided by it. Access to information about travelers passing through the region was given to them by it. Most importantly, pillars of the community whose word would never be questioned by local authorities were established by them. An extensive network of business relationships that helped legitimize their growing wealth was also developed by the sisters. Land purchases throughout the region were invested in by them, gradually assembling a portfolio of properties that generated rental income and appreciated in value. Money to local farmers and merchants was loaned by them, earning both interest payments and influence within the community. Shares in several riverboat companies operating on the Ohio River were even purchased by them, diversifying their investments while creating additional sources of income. By 1845, among the wealthiest landowners in Western Virginia were the Cunningham Sisters. An example of what determined women could achieve, even in the challenging frontier environment, was what their success story was held up as. Occasionally, articles about the enterprising Cunningham Sisters, who had built a thriving business empire from their inherited mountain property, were featured in local newspapers. But beneath this facade of legitimate success lay the carefully concealed bones of more than 40 men who had made the fatal mistake of accepting the sisters' hospitality. To their wealth had been added by each death and refined their methods, creating a cycle of murder and profit that seemed impossible to stop or detect. Something even more valuable was now provided by the isolation that had initially protected them from discovery, the perfect environment for their predatory activities. A spider's web had been become by Millbrook Inn, beautiful and inviting on the surface, but deadly to anyone who became entangled in its strands. Not from law enforcement or suspicious relatives, but from an unexpected source, one of their own employees, came the beginning of the end. Since a hunting accident in the fall of 1849 that left him with chronic pain and a dependence on laudanum for relief, Heinrich Zimmer, the younger of the two German brothers, had been growing increasingly unstable. The more sensitive of the Zimmer brothers had always been Heinrich, and a psychological toll that his brother Klaus either ignored or failed to recognize had been taken by the years of participating in the sisters' crimes. Initially prescribed by Sarah for legitimate pain relief, the laudanum had gradually become Heinrich's escape from the guilt and nightmares that plagued his sleep. But its own problems were brought by addiction, paranoia, mood swings, and a tendency toward loose talk that made him increasingly dangerous to the operation. On a cold February morning in 1850 was when the crisis began, when Heinrich appeared at the kitchen door of the main house, his eyes wild with drug-induced panic and his clothes disheveled from a sleepless night. Alone in the kitchen, Sarah was preparing breakfast for a traveling merchant from North Carolina who had arrived the previous evening, a man the sisters had already identified as their next target. "I can't do it anymore," Heinrich whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I see their faces every night. Every time I close my eyes, they're all standing there watching me. 43 men, Sarah. 43 souls crying out for justice. Her composure was maintained by Sarah, but her mind raced as she calculated the threat Heinrich now represented. Complete and detailed was his knowledge of their crimes. Exact locations of burial sites, descriptions of murder methods, and testimony that would send all 4 sisters to the gallows could be provided by him to authorities. "You're not well, Heinrich," she said gently, moving closer to him with apparent concern. "The laudanum is affecting your mind. You're seeing things that aren't real." "No," Heinrich's voice rose dangerously, and Sarah glanced toward the ceiling, hoping the guest upstairs hadn't been awakened. "I know what we've done. I know what you've made me do. And I know it has to stop." For nearly an hour, the conversation continued with Heinrich alternating between tearful confessions and angry accusations while Sarah tried to calm him without alerting the rest of the household. She eventually managed to convince him to return to his cabin with a promise that they would discuss the situation later after he'd had time to rest and clear his head. But Sarah knew there would be no later discussion. A liability that threatened everything they'd built had been become by Heinrich Zimmer, and liabilities had to be eliminated. That evening, after their guest had retired for the night, a special dinner for the Zimmer brothers was prepared by Sarah, a gesture of appreciation for their years of loyal service, she explained to Klaus. Heinrich's favorite dishes were featured in the meal along with Sarah's special spiced wine that contained enough concentrated foxglove extract to stop a man's heart within hours. Quietly in his sleep that night, Heinrich died. The same heart condition that had supposedly claimed several of their guests over the years was what his death was attributed to. Due to his natural temperance, Klaus, who had consumed less of the poisoned wine, survived, but with significant cardiac damage that left him weakened and dependent on Sarah's medical care. Their immediate problem was solved by Heinrich's death, but new challenges were created. Despite his physical weakness, Klaus began asking pointed questions about his brother's sudden demise. The similarities between Heinrich's symptoms and those exhibited by several of their guests had not escaped his notice, and under the weight of suspicion and grief, his loyalty to the sisters was wavering. That their operation was entering a critical phase was recognized by Margaret. Beginning to fracture was the network of trust and complicity that had protected them for nearly 2 decades, and evidence that even their considerable influence couldn't suppress would be uncovered by any significant investigation. Contingency plans for the possibility that they might need to abandon Millbrook Inn were begun to be made by her. Samuel Hartwell, a cotton broker from Savannah who arrived in March 1851 with over $1,000 in gold coins and banknotes, was the final guest to die at Millbrook Inn. A widower in his 50s, Hartwell was traveling north to negotiate contracts with textile mills in Pennsylvania. The sisters' established pattern was followed by his death, apparent heart failure after several days of exceptional hospitality that included intimate companionship with Catherine. But a crucial change in the sisters' methodology was marked by Hartwell's death. For the first time in nearly 20 years, a significant mistake was made by them. A business associate in Pittsburgh on a specific date had been arranged to be met by Hartwell, and when he failed to appear, inquiries were begun to be made by his colleague that eventually reached local authorities in Virginia. A capable lawman with over 20 years of experience was Sheriff Thomas Brennan of Millbrook County, but he had never encountered anything like the Cunningham Sisters operation. Routine was his initial investigation. A few questions to confirm that Hartwell had indeed stayed at the inn and departed in good health. Their usual testimony was provided by Margaret and Ezra, supported by carefully maintained guest records that showed Hartwell's departure date and intended destination. But more persistent than previous inquirers was Brennan, and small inconsistencies in the sisters' story were begun to be uncovered by his investigation. A horse that matched the description of Hartwell's mount was remembered to be shod by a blacksmith in the next county, but several days after the businessman was supposed to have passed through the area. Supplies from someone who resembled Hartwell were recalled to be purchased by a merchant, but again the timing didn't match the official departure date from Millbrook Inn. Minor were these discrepancies and might have been explained by any number of innocent factors, but they were enough to plant seeds of doubt in Brennan's mind. More closely at other missing persons cases involving travelers who had last been seen in the Millbrook Inn area was begun to be looked at by him, and deeply troubling was the pattern that emerged. rapidly accelerated once he began examining the broader pattern of disappearances around Millbrook Inn was Sheriff Brennan's investigation. That over the past 20 years, at least 15 different missing persons cases had involved travelers who were last confirmed to be staying at the Cunningham property was revealed by his review of county records. While individual cases could be explained by the various hazards of frontier travel, impossible to ignore was the statistical clustering. Not to alert the sisters to his investigation was Brennan's carefulness, conducting his inquiries discreetly and avoiding direct contact with anyone connected to the inn. When he interviewed Klaus Zimmer during one of the German immigrants' rare trips to town for supplies, his breakthrough came. Still grieving his brother's death and increasingly suspicious about the circumstances surrounding it, Klaus proved more talkative than usual. "My brother Heinrich. He was troubled before he died," Klaus told Brennan during what appeared to be a casual conversation outside the general store. "He spoke of things that kept him awake at night. The mountains hold many secrets, Sheriff, and not all of them should stay buried." Nothing might have been meant by this cryptic statement to a less experienced investigator, but the signs of a man struggling with dangerous knowledge were recognized by Brennan. A private meeting with Klaus at a location far from Millbrook Inn was arranged by him, where the full truth finally began to emerge. Halting and incomplete was Klaus's confession. Years of fear and loyalty struggled against guilt and suspicion as he revealed fragments of what he knew. He couldn't bring himself to explicitly accuse the sisters of murder, but enough details about mysterious late-night activities, unexplained burials, and his brother's growing distress were provided by him to give Brennan the evidence he needed to obtain search warrants. At dawn on April 15, 1851, the raid on Millbrook Inn was conducted with a force of 8 armed deputies surrounding the property to prevent escape. With federal marshals, Brennan had coordinated to ensure that any evidence found would be properly handled. Recognizing that the case might involve crimes across state lines, the sisters met the arrival of law enforcement with characteristic composure. With polite concern, Margaret greeted Brennan at the front door, expressing hope that she could assist with whatever investigation had brought him to their property. Genuinely distressed by the suggestion that anything improper might have occurred at their respectable establishment appeared Catherine. Refreshments for the officers were offered by Sarah, while confused and frightened by the accusations being leveled against her family seemed Elizabeth. But the physical evidence that 20 years of murder had left behind couldn't be concealed by their practiced performances. Several items that clearly belonged to missing travelers were revealed by the search of the main house: a distinctive silver pocket watch engraved with Samuel Hartwell's initials, a leather portfolio containing business documents belonging to Thomas Kellerman, and a collection of personal letters and photographs that represented dozens of different victims. More damning still was Sarah's carefully maintained garden of poisonous plants, which included several species that had no legitimate medicinal applications. An expertise in toxicology that went far beyond the knowledge required for normal household remedies was revealed by her collection of books on botany and chemistry. Detailed notes describing the effects and dosages of various plant toxins along with records that clearly corresponded to the deaths of specific guests were found by investigators hidden in her private room. The final piece of evidence needed to confirm the scope of the sisters' crimes was the discovery of the burial caves. Facing charges as an accessory to murder, Klaus led investigators to the concealed entrance behind the rockfall. Inside the caves, exactly as the railroad surveyor would find them months later, were the skeletal remains of 43 men along with personal effects worth thousands of dollars. Its own story of violent death was told by each skeleton. That some victims had been killed quickly with sharp instruments, likely while they were unconscious from poison or alcohol, was indicated by the puncture wounds found at the base of several skulls. Signs of strangulation or suffocation were shown by others. From poison alone, a few appeared to have died, their bones showing the chemical changes associated with heavy metal toxicity. One of the most sensational legal proceedings in Virginia history became the trial of the Cunningham Sisters. The case was covered by newspapers throughout the country, fascinated by the story of 4 women who had operated one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history. Overwhelming evidence of a conspiracy that had lasted nearly 20 years and claimed more than 40 lives was presented by the prosecution led by Commonwealth Attorney Daniel Hutchinson. Throughout the proceedings, her innocence was maintained by Margaret, claiming that any evidence found at the inn had been planted by enemies seeking to destroy their family's reputation. Completely during her testimony, Catherine broke down, alternating between denials and tearful confessions that implicated all four sisters in the murders. At all, Sarah refused to speak, maintaining a stoic silence that many interpreted as an admission of guilt. The youngest and most sympathetic defendant, Elizabeth, claimed to have been coerced by her older sisters and begged for mercy from the court. On the isolation and vulnerability of four orphaned women trying to survive in a dangerous frontier environment, the defense strategy focused. That they had been driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond their control was argued by the sisters' attorney, Marcus Fairfield, and that their youth and gender should be considered as mitigating factors in their sentencing. But any sympathy was made difficult to sustain by the overwhelming evidence and the shocking scope of their crimes. For less than 3 hours, the jury deliberated before returning guilty verdicts for all four defendants on multiple counts of murder in the first degree. Swift and final was the sentencing. To hang were condemned Margaret, Catherine, and Sarah, their execution scheduled for October 12, 1851. Largely due to her age at the time the crimes began and her apparent cooperation with authorities, Elizabeth received a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As scheduled on a gray October morning, the executions were carried out with hundreds of spectators gathering to witness the end of the Cunningham Sisters' story. With the same cold composure she had shown throughout the trial, Margaret faced her death, offering no final words of remorse or explanation. Together on the scaffold, Catherine and Sarah stood, holding hands as the nooses were placed around their necks, their final moment of sisterly solidarity a stark contrast to the calculated cruelty they had shown their victims. To the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond was Elizabeth Cunningham transported, where she would spend the remaining 37 years of her life. That she maintained her innocence until her death in 1888 is indicated by prison records, claiming repeatedly that she had been a victim of her sister's manipulation rather than a willing participant in their crimes. She never received visitors and left no written account of her experiences at Millbrook Inn. Shortly after the trial concluded, Klaus Zimmer, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, disappeared. In Ohio, some reports placed him, in Missouri, others, but he was never officially located again. Completely appeared to have broken him the trauma of his brother's death and his role in exposing the sisters' crimes, leaving him unable to settle anywhere or form lasting relationships. Charges as an accessory to murder were faced by Ezra Hawthorne, but his advanced age and his cooperation with authorities earned him a reduced sentence of 10 years in prison. In custody in 1854, he died, reportedly still maintaining that he had never suspected the true nature of the sisters' activities and had believed their explanations for the various deaths and disappearances. At auction to satisfy legal judgments against the Cunningham estate, Millbrook Inn itself was sold. A family named Fletcher from Richmond, the new owners, attempted to continue operating it as a legitimate inn, but impossible to attract guests was made by the property's notorious reputation. For several years, the building stood empty before being purchased by a mining company that demolished the structures and converted the land to industrial use. Permanently sealed by order of the court was the copper mine where the victims' remains were discovered, with a simple stone marker erected to commemorate the 43 men who died at Millbrook Inn. Only the inscription is borne by the marker, which still stands today according to local historical societies. Here lie unknown travelers 1832 to 1851. May they find the peace in death that was denied them in life. Far-reaching implications for inn and hotel regulation throughout Virginia and neighboring states were had by the case. New laws requiring more detailed guest registration procedures, mandatory reporting of guest deaths to local authorities, and regular inspections of establishments serving travelers were enacted. Well into the 20th century, the Cunningham laws, as they became known, remained in effect. Perhaps most significantly, a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the potential for evil to flourish in places far from civilized oversight became the Millbrook Inn case. Closer attention to patterns of disappearances around remote establishments was begun to be paid by criminal investigators, leading to the discovery of several smaller-scale operations that might otherwise have continued undetected. The true scope of the sisters' success was revealed by the financial investigation. Their estate, including land holdings, business investments, and liquid assets, was valued at over $50,000, an enormous fortune for the time period. To compensate victims' families where possible, and to fund improvements to law enforcement capabilities in remote areas of Virginia, the money was used. Several factors that contributed to the sisters' remarkable success are noted by modern criminologists who have studied the case. Their operation combined careful victim selection, sophisticated killing methods, excellent disposal techniques, and most importantly, a perfect cover story that made their crimes nearly invisible to contemporary investigators. Privacy for their activities was provided by the isolation of their location, while a steady stream of potential victims was created by their reputation for hospitality. That Margaret was the primary architect of the operation is suggested by the psychological profiles developed by modern experts, possessing the antisocial personality traits and organizational skills necessary to plan and execute such a complex criminal enterprise. From what would now be recognized as borderline personality disorder, Catherine likely suffered, making her capable of forming intense but ultimately meaningless emotional connections with victims. A fascination with death and control that bordered on sadistic is suggested by Sarah's expertise with poisons. The most ambiguous remains Elizabeth's role. Whether she was a willing participant or a coerced accomplice may never be definitively determined. Particularly chilling is what makes the Millbrook Inn case, how easily it could have continued indefinitely. Had Heinrich Zimmer not suffered his psychological breakdown, or had Sheriff Brennan been less persistent in his investigation, the sisters might have continued their activities for decades longer. A reminder that many historical crimes may have gone completely undetected is served by the randomness of their ultimate discovery, their perpetrators taking their secrets to unmarked graves. The vulnerability of travelers in the pre-industrial era is also highlighted by the story of the Cunningham Sisters. When communication was slow and transportation was dangerous, a man could disappear between two towns and not be missed for months, if ever. This vulnerability was exploited by the sisters with ruthless efficiency, turning the hospitality industry itself into a weapon against the lonely and isolated. For generations, local folklore in Western Virginia preserved distorted versions of the Millbrook Inn story. As victims of circumstance who were driven to desperate measures by poverty and isolation, some tales portrayed the sisters, through magical means rather than simple manipulation, others transformed them into supernatural entities who lured victims. Both more mundane and more terrifying than any ghost story is the truth, as revealed by court records and contemporary accounts. Well into the 20th century, the physical location of Millbrook Inn remained a source of local superstition. Unusual artifacts in the area were reported by hunters and hikers: old buttons, pieces of clothing, rusted metal objects that might once have belonged to the sisters' victims. Whether these discoveries were genuine relics or simply the products of overactive imaginations influenced by the location's notorious history remains unknown. Over the years, several attempts were made to locate additional burial sites that might contain victims who were disposed of through other methods. Several soil anomalies consistent with unmarked graves were identified by ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1980s, but legal and ethical considerations prevented extensive excavation. That the 43 victims found in the mine represent only a portion of the sisters' total kill count remains the possibility. Researchers and amateur historians fascinated by one of America's most successful serial killing operations continue to be attracted by the Cunningham case file, housed in the Virginia State Archives. An unusually complete picture of how such crimes were planned and executed in the 19th century is provided by the detailed records kept by Margaret Cunningham, combined with Sarah's botanical notes and the physical evidence recovered from the property. How easily evil can hide behind a facade of respectability and how isolation can provide the perfect cover for the most heinous crimes is shown to us by this mystery. That monsters don't always look like monsters is served as a reminder by the story of the Cunningham Sisters. Sometimes they look like charming hostesses offering weary travelers exactly what they need most. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be more secrets buried in those Virginia mountains? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think really happened at Millbrook Inn. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell and share with someone who loves mysteries. The past is full of dark secrets waiting to be uncovered, and I'll be here to help you discover them. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another chapter from America's hidden history of terror.